An 84-year-old widow stood beneath her porch light, ready to hand a stranger her gold. Then she slipped her late husband's wedding ring into the bag and whispered, "I'm sorry." My 2-month-old K9 began to tremble in my arms. The man on the phone knew the secret code. If you believe God still protects the lonely before the light goes out, leave amen. I was 24 years old when I first learned that a crime could enter a home without breaking a window, touching a lock, or leaving a footprint in the snow. It could arrive as a calm voice on the telephone. It could wear the borrowed name of the government. It could speak gently enough to make an old woman believe she was being protected, even while it was leading her toward the loss of everything she had spent a lifetime guarding. That was how my second old file with Rin began, not with sirens or a chase, but with the faint sound of a church bell hiding behind a stranger's voice. Willow Harbor, Michigan, looked innocent when Special Agent Daniel Mercer and I drove in that morning. The town sat beside a cold northern lake that flashed silver under the early sun. Maple trees leaned over the streets like old neighbors sharing secrets, and nearly every house had a porch with a rocking chair, a flower box, or a brass wind chime. Daniel was the lead investigator from the Detroit field office, a tall man in his late 40s with broad shoulders, weather-lined skin, and a square jaw softened by a neatly trimmed gray beard. He had the quiet patience of someone who had seen enough sorrow to stop rushing past it. He did not talk much in the car, but when he did, his words landed like stones placed carefully across a river. In the back seat, wrapped in a blue training blanket, was Rin. He was only 2 months old then, a sable German shepherd puppy with oversized paws, soft half-lifted ears, and eyes too serious for a creature who still tripped over his own feet. Rin was not an official K9, not yet. He was in early socialization, and I had been allowed to care for him while his future was still only a question mark. He had the round belly of a puppy, the solemn face of a tiny judge, and the habit of pressing his nose against my sleeve whenever the world felt too loud. Daniel had raised one eyebrow when I brought Rin along, but he only said, "Keep him safe, Ward, and keep him out of the work." I promised I would. Rin sneezed on the promise, which Daniel took as official paperwork. Our first stop was the house of Eleanor Whitcomb. She was 76, a retired music teacher, and a widow of 8 years. Her home stood at the end of a narrow lane where wild asters grew along the fence. It was a small white house with pale blue shutters, a clean porch, and a wooden rocking chair facing the lake. Eleanor opened the door before we knocked twice. She was a slender woman with silver hair pinned at the back of her head, soft brown skin marked by age spots, and hands that seemed made for piano keys rather than fear. She wore a lavender cardigan over a white blouse, and though she tried to stand straight, shame had bent something inside her before we ever arrived. "I almost did it," she said after Daniel introduced us. "I almost gave it all away." We sat at her kitchen table while sunlight crossed the floor in quiet squares. There was a cold cup of tea near her elbow, untouched. Beside it lay a yellow notepad covered in trembling handwriting. Dates, phone numbers, fragments of instructions. She told us the calls had begun 3 days earlier. A man said he was with a federal financial protection division. He told her that her retirement account had been flagged in connection with illegal financial activity. He knew her bank. He knew her full name. He even knew her late husband's name, Samuel Whitcomb, and said that unless she cooperated, his records could be pulled into the matter too. The cruelty of that sentence entered the room like a draft. Eleanor looked down at her hands. Sam kept everything honest, every receipt, every tax paper, every little note. He used to say a clean name was worth more than a full pocket. She tried to smile, but it fluttered and faded. When that man said Sam's name, I stopped thinking clearly. The caller had instructed her to withdraw money and convert it into gold. He did not ask for one special keepsake, not at first. He used colder language. He told her that all precious metal items in the home must be sealed to prevent asset record errors. The words sounded official enough to frighten her. He said a secure property receiver would come soon. The receiver would know the code. Chapel porch. Daniel wrote the phrase down without changing expression. I was still learning how to do that. My face wanted to reveal everything: pity, anger, disbelief. But Daniel had once told me that witnesses often borrowed calm from the room. If we let our own feelings spill too quickly, they might feel they had to comfort us. So I kept my voice gentle and asked if she remembered anything in the background of the calls. Eleanor closed her eyes. "A bell?" she whispered. "Like a church bell. Very soft." I thought maybe he was calling from some federal building near a chapel. That sounds foolish now. "No," Daniel said, "it does not." Then the telephone rang. One sharp sound cut through the kitchen, bright and sudden, and Eleanor's teacup trembled against its saucer. Rin, who had been curled beneath my chair, lifted his small head and gave a thin, aching whine. For one breath, nobody moved. The house felt as if it were holding its lungs full of cold water. Daniel nodded once. I picked up the receiver but said nothing. At first there was only faint static. Then came the voice, male, smooth, almost kind. Behind it, so soft I might have missed it if Eleanor had not warned us, a bell sounded in the distance. "Mrs. Whitcomb," the man said, "remember, only the porch code can keep your husband's name safe." I looked at Daniel. His hand rose, palm down. "Do not answer." The voice continued, patient as a pastor at a bedside. "Do not trust anyone who does not know the code. Chapel porch. You must be ready." Eleanor's eyes filled, but she did not cry. That was worse somehow. Tears would have moved. Her fear simply sat inside her like an old stone. Rin pushed himself against my ankle, then turned his little face toward the porch window. I followed his gaze. Outside, the rocking chair moved gently in the lake wind. "Mrs. Whitcomb," I said after the line went silent, "did you tell the caller about that chair?" Her mouth parted. She looked toward the porch as if seeing her own home from far away. "No, I do not think so." She swallowed. "Sam sat there every evening. Even after he grew weak, he would sit there and tell me the lake was showing off again." A faint warmth crossed her face, then vanished. "The caller told me to wait beside Sam's chair when the receiver came. He said it would make the process safer." Daniel's pen stopped moving. That was the moment the case changed shape for me. We were not dealing only with a voice from nowhere. Someone knew Eleanor's porch. Someone knew the chair. Someone had learned which memory would make her obey. The crime was no longer floating through telephone wires. It had stepped close enough to look through a window. Daniel thanked Eleanor and promised that no one would take her savings that day. He did not promise more than he could give. That was one of the first things I admired about him. He offered safety in pieces strong enough to stand on. Before we left, Eleanor touched the notepad where she had written Chapel Porch. "I feel foolish," she said. I shook my head. "You were afraid. That is different." She looked at me then, really looked, and I wondered if she saw how young I was. Maybe she did. Maybe she forgave it. At the door, Rin wriggled out of his blanket and sat clumsily near the threshold, his soft ears tilting toward the porch. The rocking chair creaked again in the wind. Eleanor folded her arms tightly over her cardigan and watched it move. Daniel signaled for me not to speak about the call yet, not in front of her, not until we understood what we had heard. So I said only goodbye. But as we stepped outside, I understood something I had not understood that morning. The people behind those calls were not merely after gold. They were reaching into the quiet rooms where love still lived after loss. They were learning the shape of loneliness and using it like a key. Behind me, through the screen door, I saw Rin curl at Eleanor's feet for one last moment before I lifted him back into my arms. His eyes stayed fixed on the empty rocking chair, as if even a puppy could sense that the chair was not empty to her. And that was where the file truly began. By the second morning in Willow Harbor, I had begun to understand that the town had two faces. One was the face it showed to visitors: bright windows, tidy porches, lake wind moving through maple branches, and shopkeepers who waved as if they had known you since Sunday school. The other face was quieter. It lived behind drawn curtains, beside cold coffee cups, inside the hands of old people who answered their telephones because they still believed a serious voice deserved respect. Daniel Mercer saw that second face before I did. He had a way of watching a street as if every mailbox might confess something. I was still young enough to look for the loudest clue in the room. Daniel looked for the thing that had been gently moved and carefully put back. Our next interview took us to a small greenhouse near the old post office where Harold Finch had lived alone for nearly 12 years. Harold was 81, tall once but folded now by age, with a narrow chest, long fingers, and white hair that stood up in soft wisps no comb could persuade. His face was lean and thoughtful, with deep lines around his mouth from a lifetime of patient concentration. He wore brown suspenders over a plaid shirt, and had the precise, careful manner of a man who had spent decades repairing tiny wheels inside clocks. Even his humor ticked softly. When he opened the door and saw Daniel's badge, he sighed and said, "Well, if this is about my lawn, I have already made peace with the weeds." He invited us into a kitchen that smelled of toast, brass polish, and old paper. Rin stayed close to my shoes, wrapped partly in his little blue blanket, his sable fur catching the pale morning light. He had slept poorly after Eleanor's house, waking twice in the motel room with tiny whines, as if the telephone bell had followed him into his dreams. I reminded myself that he was only a puppy, not a partner, not an agent, not a miracle on four paws. Yet when he entered Harold's kitchen, his small nose lifted and his round puppy body grew very still. Harold had received the same kind of call. A man claimed to be with a federal financial office and told him his retirement account had been flagged. The caller said Harold's funds could be frozen if he failed to cooperate. Harold tried to laugh while telling us, but the laugh had no weight behind it. "I spent 40 years fixing timepieces," he said, looking toward the window over the sink. And somehow, one smooth-talking fellow on the phone made me feel I had run out of time. Daniel asked what the caller knew. Harold's answer changed the air in the room. The caller knew Harold ate breakfast at 7. He knew Harold kept most of his savings in one local bank. He knew Harold owned a pocket watch that had belonged to his father, a railway man who had carried it through long winters and lonely stations. Harold had not posted that story anywhere. He had not told many people. But he had told one man recently, with pride, during a free community event called Senior Memory Appraisal Day. "That was at Harbor Ledger Antiques," Harold said. "Mr. Bellamy's place. Fine man, everyone says. He listens like he has nowhere else in the world to be." That name came softly, but Daniel wrote it down. Graham Bellamy was 58, Harold told us, a broad-shouldered man with a calm smile, neatly trimmed gray beard, and warm brown sweaters that made him look like a pastor who had chosen furniture instead of sermons. He owned Harbor Ledger Antiques, a shop 2 blocks from the square, and people called him the keeper of Willow Harbor's memories. He appraised wedding rings, music boxes, service medals, old watches, framed photographs, china sets, and whatever else children in distant cities no longer knew how to ask about. Harold said Bellamy had never rushed him. That seemed to wound Harold most of all. Rin shuffled forward on clumsy paws and sat beside a small wooden box on the kitchen shelf. His ears tilted, one higher than the other, and he gave a soft puff through his nose. I glanced at Daniel, half expecting him to remind me again that Rin was not working, but Daniel only watched. "What is in the box?" I asked. Harold reached for it with both hands. "My father's watch." He opened the box and took out a silver pocket watch, worn smooth along the edges. The chain had darkened with age, and the glass face held a fine scratch shaped almost like a river. Harold placed it on the table with the tenderness another man might use for a sleeping bird. Rin did not bark. He did not leap. He simply leaned forward and sniffed once, then tucked himself against my ankle as if the object made him uneasy. Harold turned the watch over to show us the back. Bellamy opened this panel during the appraisal, said he wanted to check the maker's mark. His thumb pressed the tiny latch. The back clicked open. A small paper sliver slipped out and landed on the table without a sound, but somehow the whole kitchen seemed to hear it. Sunlight caught the edge of the paper. Harold stopped breathing for a moment. Rin pressed his nose against my boot, and the ticking of the old watch suddenly sounded much too loud. Daniel did not touch the paper at first. He photographed it where it lay. Then he used a clean evidence sleeve and lifted it under the window light. Written on it in cramped blue ink were the letters HLA, followed by part of Harold's street name and 2 numbers that matched the last digits of his phone number. Harold's face changed in a way I never forgot. It was not fear first. It was embarrassment, then confusion, then a small, quiet sorrow. "I did not put that there," he said. "I would remember. I know every little corner of that watch." "I believe you," Daniel said. Harold looked at him, hungry for those words. People forget how much power there is in being believed. In that moment, Harold looked less like a witness and more like a man who had just discovered that a story about his father had been folded into a trap. We asked more about Senior Memory Appraisal Day. Harold said Bellamy had hosted it at the start of the month with coffee, lemon cookies, soft music, and little cards where seniors wrote their names, phone numbers, and the history of each item. Eleanor had attended too. So had a widow named Marion Lark, and at least 2 others Daniel had already marked for follow-up. Bellamy had asked kind questions. "Who gave you this? Do you still live in the old house? Any children nearby to help keep these treasures safe?" At the time, those questions sounded thoughtful. In a notebook, they would look like a map. When we stepped outside, the lake wind had turned colder. Daniel stood by the car and called Mara Quinn, a financial analyst attached to the regional task force. I had not met her yet, but Daniel described her as a woman who could find a pattern in a grocery receipt and make a banker nervous before lunch. He asked her to compare the dates of Bellamy's event with unusual withdrawals, gold purchases, and reports of suspicious calls around Willow Harbor. While he spoke, Harold remained on the porch holding the empty watch box. His shoulders looked smaller than they had when we arrived. He tried to make one last joke, saying his father would be offended that anyone had used such poor handwriting near a fine watch. Daniel smiled politely. I could not. I kept seeing the little paper sliver. I kept seeing how easily it had hidden inside something sacred to Harold. That was the cruelty of it. The object had not been forced open in the dark. It had been opened in daylight by a polite man at a community table, while an old son proudly told a story about his father. Rin yawned and put both front paws on my shoe, asking in his puppy way to be lifted. I picked him up, and he tucked his head beneath my chin. His warm weight steadied me. Across the street, the sign for Harbor Ledger Antiques swung gently in the wind, its gold letters bright against dark green paint. Daniel ended the call and looked at me. Mara will run the dates. And Bellamy? We do not decide what he is yet, Daniel said. We let the evidence decide. That was another lesson I needed. Anger wanted to move faster than proof. My heart had already stepped toward the antique shop with a warrant in one hand and a question in the other. But Daniel was right. A case built on outrage could fall apart. A case built on patience could stand. As we drove away, Harold's pocket watch sat sealed in an evidence bag on the seat between Daniel and me. It kept ticking, steady and small, like time itself refusing to be frightened. I looked back once and saw Harold still on his porch, one hand raised in farewell, the other pressed against his chest, where the memory of the watch had always lived. That was when I understood something deeper about the file. Sometimes a crime did not begin with a lie. Sometimes it began with a man who listened too well, smiled too gently, and remembered exactly where the heart was softest. By the fourth day, Willow Harbor no longer looked harmless to me. The lake still glittered under the morning sun, the bakery still set warm rolls in the window, and the old men outside the post office still argued gently over baseball, like it was a matter of national survival. But once you know someone has been studying porches, windows, rocking chairs, and lonely routines, a pretty town begins to feel like a stage with curtains pulled too neatly into place. Daniel taught me not to let suspicion turn the whole world dark, but I could feel it happening inside me anyway. Every silver car became a question. Every polite smile had a shadow behind it. Mara Quinn arrived before lunch with 2 folders, a laptop, and the tired eyes of a woman who had spent the night making numbers confess. She was in her late 30s, medium height, with dark auburn hair cut just below her jaw, pale skin freckled across the nose, and rectangular glasses she kept pushing up with one finger when she was thinking. She had a calm, dry manner that made panic feel almost rude in her presence. Mara did not raise her voice. She did not need to. When she placed her folders on the conference table in the small police substation, even Daniel leaned forward. "The dates line up," she said. "Not perfectly enough for a television show, but perfectly enough for court to care." She had compared the senior memory appraisal day records with suspicious calls reported by local seniors, unusual bank visits, and gold purchase inquiries within the region. After the appraisal event, several older residents had received frightening calls within 7 to 12 days. Eleanor Whitcomb, Harold Finch, a widow named Marion Lark, who had not yet spoken to us but had recently asked her bank about precious metals. And one more name Mara underlined twice: Agnes Rowe, 84, a woman living on a hill road north of town. "No confirmed loss yet," Mara said. But her phone records show repeated calls from rotating numbers, and there was a bank appointment yesterday. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice even. "Vehicles?" Mara opened the second folder. Grainy stills from neighborhood cameras spread across the table like dull little windows. A silver SUV appeared near Eleanor's lane 2 days before her final call. The same model appeared near Herald Street the morning after Bellamy's appraisal event. The plate was different in each frame, but the dent over the left rear wheel was the same. In one image, a figure inside the SUV held something toward Harold's house. Not a tool, not a package. A phone. "They were taking pictures," I said. Mara nodded. "Porches, mailboxes, driveways, windows, anything that would help a caller sound close." The thought made my stomach turn. I had imagined the callers far away, hidden behind wires and false titles. Now I pictured someone sitting in a parked SUV, framing an old woman's rocking chair in the square of a phone screen, learning where her heart rested at dusk. That was not just planning. It was a kind of emotional trespass. Still, Daniel would not move faster than the evidence allowed. The paper marked HLA from Harold's watch gave us one thread. The camera images gave us another. Eleanor's statement that Bellamy had asked about her porch habits and Sam's chair added weight. Together, they were enough for Daniel to seek a limited search warrant, but not before we spoke to Bellamy once more in daylight and gave him room to show us what kind of man he wanted us to believe he was. Harbor Ledger Antiques sat on the corner of Maple and 3rd beneath a dark green sign with gold letters and a painted lantern. The front windows were arranged beautifully. Lace tablecloths, polished clocks, porcelain birds, brass lamps, a child's sled from some older winter. A bell over the door gave a soft chime when Daniel and I stepped inside. Rin was tucked inside my coat against my chest, half asleep and warm, his little sable head just visible above the zipper. I had told myself he was there only because I could not leave a 2-month-old puppy alone in the car. Daniel looked at me once, then looked away in a way that meant he understood and disapproved equally. Graham Bellamy came from behind a counter with open hands and a gentle smile. Harold had described him well. Bellamy was a sturdy man of 58 with broad shoulders, careful posture, silver hair brushed back from a high forehead, and a gray beard trimmed close along a square jaw. His eyes were light blue and practiced in softness. He wore a brown wool sweater over a collared shirt, and he moved slowly, as if quick gestures might disrespect the old things around him. "Agents," he said, warm as a fireplace. "I heard you were helping Mrs. Whitcomb. Terrible business. These scams have become a sorrowful plague." He sounded sincere. That bothered me more than if he had sounded false. Daniel told him we were following up on Harold Finch's pocket watch. Bellamy placed a hand over his heart, the way some people do when they want their empathy seen. Harold's father was a railway man, he said. A proud story. People forget that objects are not objects to the old. They are proof they were loved. The words were beautiful. They were also too close to the wound. From somewhere deep in the shop, a music box suddenly opened into sound, 3 bright notes, then a low bell tone that rolled through the room like a chapel hidden under the floorboards. Rin stiffened against my chest. The tiny hairs along his neck lifted, and for one suspended second, even Bellamy stopped smiling. Then he chuckled softly. "Old Swiss mechanism, sensitive to floorboards. It startles everyone." I smiled because I had to, but my pulse had changed. Rin had turned his face toward a tall walnut cabinet near the back wall where several antique music boxes sat behind glass. He did not bark. He did not wriggle free. He only made a small, uneasy sound and pressed one paw against my coat. I followed his gaze and saw that the cabinet stood slightly off the wall, not enough to accuse, only enough to remember. Daniel asked routine questions. How many seniors attended the appraisal day? Were contact cards kept? Did Bellamy have staff? Bellamy answered smoothly. He had hosted the event as a service to the community. He kept cards only for appraisal follow-ups. No, he would never share private information. Yes, he remembered Eleanor, Harold, and Marion. Agnes Rowe, too, dear woman, still carrying her husband's ring on a chain as if love needed no insurance but memory. I felt Daniel's silence sharpen beside me. When we left, Daniel did not speak until we reached the car. "You saw the cabinet?" "Yes." "Rin smelled something?" "He noticed the sound first," I said carefully. "Then the cabinet." "That is not evidence." "I know." But it became a place to look when the warrant came through that evening. The search was narrow, quiet, and professional. Bellamy was not present. The shop had closed, and a local officer unlocked the door under court authorization. Daniel directed every movement. Mara photographed the counter cards and business records. I stood back with Rin in my arms, reminding myself that a puppy's curiosity had no legal standing, but a good investigator's memory did. When Daniel opened the walnut cabinet, the front shelves held exactly what they promised. Music boxes, some brass, some wood, one painted with faded roses. Behind them, however, the back panel did not sit flush. Daniel removed it with gloved hands. There was no dramatic stack of ledgers, no villain's confession tied with ribbon. Real cases were rarely that generous. Instead, we found a small USB drive taped beneath the panel, 4 printed porch photographs, a short list of coded initials, and a digital recorder containing several versions of the same bell tone. Mara looked at the items and whispered, "That is enough to make my evening unpleasant." Back at the substation, she opened the USB on an isolated machine. Folders appeared with names that were not names. EWHFMLAR. Inside were photos of porches, driveways, mailbox numbers, kitchen windows, notes about routines, and short emotional markers. Eleanor's file read, "Widow, husband chair, answers afternoon." Harold's read, "Watch story, father railway, breakfast 7." Marion Lark's read, "Sewing basket, lives alone, cautious." Then Mara opened the file marked AR. Agnes Rowe's porch filled the screen. A yellow porch light glowed above a white railing. Beside the door was a rocking chair with a folded quilt over the back. The photograph had been taken from a distance, likely from the road below. Under it, someone had typed, "Ring present, husband deceased, porch light phrase. Final pickup, day 8. No one spoke for a moment. I thought of Eleanor's chair, Harold's watch, the way Bellamy had said objects were proof people had been loved. Maybe he believed that. Maybe that was what made him so dangerous. He knew the truth of these things, and he still used them. Daniel closed the folder, but the image stayed in my mind. "We do not arrest him yet," he said. "If Bellamy is the local collector, there is still a courier and a handler above him. We protect Agnes and let the change show itself." My first instinct was to argue. Day 8 was too close. Agnes Rowe was already a name in someone's file, already a porch in someone's drawer. But Daniel's face told me the decision had cost him something too. Patience was not coldness. Sometimes it was the hardest form of mercy. Mara played the recorder before we left. The bell tone filled the room, soft and solemn, nearly holy. Then she played the background from Eleanor's call. The two sounds met each other like a key entering a lock. The church bell had never come from a church. It had come from Harbor Ledger Antiques. By the 6th day, Agnes Rowe was no longer just a name in a folder. She was a porch light on a hill, a cup of tea beside an empty chair, and an 84-year-old woman who still spoke to her late husband as if love had only stepped into the next room. Daniel and I drove north out of Willow Harbor just after breakfast, following a road that climbed through maples and white pines until the lake opened below us like a sheet of blue glass. Agnes's house stood alone near the crest of the hill, white with green trim, weathered but cared for, with geraniums in clay pots and a narrow porch facing the water. The porch light was still glowing, though the sun was already high. Agnes opened the door before we knocked. She was small, not frail exactly, but finely made, like a bird that had survived many winters by knowing where to tuck its feet. Her white hair was braided and pinned around her head, and her skin had the soft, pale texture of old paper kept safely in a drawer. She wore a blue house dress under a cream cardigan, and around her neck hung a thin gold chain that disappeared beneath the collar. Her eyes were gray, clear, and watchful. They did not belong to a woman who was easily fooled. That made what had happened to her feel even more cruel. "You are Jessica," she said, looking straight at me. "And that must be Daniel Mercer." Daniel gave a small nod. "Yes, ma'am." Agnes's gaze dropped to the bundle inside my arms. Rin had poked his sable head from my jacket, his 2-month-old face solemn and sleepy, one ear folded sideways like a poorly kept secret. "And who is this little gentleman?" "This is Rin," I said. "He is not working. He is only learning how to behave around people." Rin chose that moment to yawn so wide his entire body seemed involved. Agnes smiled, and for a brief second the house felt warmer. Her living room was tidy and full of quiet devotion. There were framed lake photographs, shelves of old boat models, and a worn Bible on a side table with a pressed maple leaf between the pages. Near the porch door stood a wooden rocking chair with a folded quilt over its back. Beside it sat a small round table holding a second teacup. No one had drunk from it. No one would. Yet the cup was clean, placed with care, as if the person it belonged to might return before the tea cooled. "That was Thomas's chair," Agnes said before I could ask. "He built boats for 39 years and complained about every one of them like they were unruly children. Then he would stand back and admire them when he thought no one was looking." Her smile trembled, but did not break. "After he passed away, I kept the chair where it was. Some habits are not grief. Some are love with nowhere to hurry." Thomas Rowe came alive in that room without ever entering it. In a photograph above the mantel, he stood beside a half-finished wooden boat, a broad man with sun-browned skin, thick forearms, a square jaw, and a fisherman's cap pushed back on silver hair. He had a heavy mustache, the kind that made a smile look earned, and eyes that seemed to be measuring both the weather and the worth of a person. Agnes told us he had been stubborn, gentle with animals, impatient with cheap tools, and incapable of walking past a loose porch step without fixing it. Then she drew the chain from beneath her collar. A worn wedding ring hung from it. The gold had dulled with time, and the edges were smooth from years against skin. "His," she said. "Mine no longer fits the way it used to, but his has stayed close." She turned it between her fingers. Inside, in tiny engraved letters, were the words, "Find me by the porch light." I felt Rin shift against my chest. His little nose lifted toward the ring, then toward the empty rocking chair. He gave a faint whine, barely more than breath. Daniel noticed, but said nothing. Agnes had taken that ring to Bellamy's senior memory appraisal day 2 weeks earlier. She had not gone to sell it. She had gone because the church bulletin said the event was free, and because Bellamy had a reputation for treating old things with respect. She remembered him holding the ring under a lamp, turning it carefully, asking who Thomas was, how long they had been married, whether she still lived in the house they shared, whether the porch light phrase meant something special. At the time, those questions had felt tender. Now they sounded like someone finding the softest board in a bridge. Daniel laid out the plan slowly. Agnes had received the same calls, the same federal language, the same warning that her accounts could be frozen, and Thomas's records could be pulled into a review if she failed to cooperate. The caller never demanded the ring by name. That would have sounded too strange. Instead, he told her that all precious metal items in the house needed to be sealed with the gold to prevent errors in the asset record. Daniel explained that we would use a controlled package with weighted metal bars, a tracker, and no real valuables. Agnes would wear a recording device. An agent would be inside the house posing as a visiting caregiver. Medical support would wait nearby. She would not step off the porch. The courier would take the bag and leave. Nothing more. Agnes listened without interrupting. Her hands rested in her lap, one thumb rubbing the ring on the chain. "I do not want you to feel pressured," Daniel said. Agnes looked toward Thomas's chair. "Agent Mercer, when a person gets old, everyone starts speaking around them as if they have become furniture. I am not furniture." Her voice was gentle, but the steel beneath it surprised me. "If this helps someone else keep a roof, a ring, or a memory, I will stand on my own porch and do my part." That evening, as Daniel reviewed the safety positions outside, the porch light flickered once, and Rin woke with a tiny gasp against my shoulder. From inside the house came the sudden ring of Agnes's telephone, sharp as a spoon striking glass. Agnes froze with Thomas's ring open in her palm, and for one long second, even the lake wind seemed to stop. Daniel signaled for the call to be recorded. Agnes answered on speaker, her voice thin but steady. The man on the line was polite, almost soothing. He reminded her of the code, chapel porch. He reminded her that the receiver would arrive the next day. Then his tone softened in the most terrible way. "Mrs. Rowe," he said, "if one piece is missing, your husband's name may not stay protected. The review must be complete." Agnes's eyes moved to the photograph over the mantel. The call ended after 27 seconds. Daniel told her she had done well. The agent posing as her caregiver, a calm local woman named Ruth Ellis with silver blonde hair, strong hands, and the no-nonsense tenderness of a nurse who had seen both fear and stubbornness in equal measure, helped Agnes sit down. Ruth had once cared for her own mother through years of confusion, Daniel told me, and had volunteered for elder fraud operations because she disliked anyone who mistook age for weakness. I wanted to take the ring from Agnes myself and lock it away. I wanted to say no plan was worth letting that fear stay in her house overnight. But Daniel gave me a look that held me still. We had removed the real gold. We had surrounded her with protection. We had told her the truth. The rest, painfully, still belonged to Agnes. Before we left for our observation post near the lower road, I saw Agnes standing by the porch door. The lake was dark now, and the porch light wrapped her in a small gold circle. She held Thomas's ring between both hands, lips moving in a prayer or an apology. I thought she was only saying good night. I was wrong. Later, through the window, I saw her reach beneath the folded quilt on Thomas's chair and lift the blue cloth bag we had prepared. Her back was turned, and I could not see her hands clearly. I only saw the brief gleam of something small before it disappeared into the fabric. I told myself it must have been the chain, a reflection, a trick of the porch light. Inside the house, the ring settled silently among the weighted bars meant to imitate gold. Outside, in my arms, Rin woke from sleep and gave one soft, troubled whine toward the glowing porch. The 8th morning in Willow Harbor was so beautiful it almost felt unfair. Sunlight poured over Agnes Rose Hill in long golden bands, turning the lake below into a bright sheet of glass. Dew clung to the grass. A pair of sparrows hopped along the porch railing as if the world had no memory of fear. The porch light was still burning above Agnes's door, pale now beneath the morning sun, but stubbornly faithful. I sat in the back of the surveillance van across the lower road, holding Rin against my chest while Daniel Mercer watched the house through binoculars. Daniel had barely spoken since dawn. His silence was not cold. It was the kind of silence a man keeps when every moving piece could become a person's future. Ruth Ellis, still posing as Agnes's caregiver, was inside the house with a small transmitter clipped beneath her cardigan. She had checked Agnes's pulse, checked the recording device, checked the kitchen window, then told us over the radio that the house was calm. Calm was a generous word. Agnes stood on the porch in her blue dress and cream cardigan, both hands wrapped around the cloth bag we had prepared. From where I sat, she looked smaller than she had the day before, not because she had changed, but because the morning around her was too large. Her white braid was pinned neatly around her head. Her shoulders were straight. The bag in her hands held weighted bars, a tracker, and though I did not know it yet for certain, Thomas's real wedding ring. Rin was restless. At 2 months old, he still smelled faintly of milk, blanket wool, and warm puppy sleep. His sable fur rose in soft ridges along his neck whenever the radio crackled. He did not understand federal fraud or sting operations or why humans could make a gentle old woman stand on her own porch holding a bag full of sorrow. But he understood tension. His small body pressed against mine as if my heartbeat had become a language he was trying to translate. Daniel lowered the binoculars. "Everyone hold. No movement unless she steps off the porch or the courier attempts to move her." His voice carried through the radio, steady as a hand on a railing. That was the rule. Agnes would not leave the porch. The courier would take the bag and go. We needed the chain to continue, needed the receiver beyond the receiver, needed whoever used the name ledger to believe the process was still clean. My head understood that. My heart kept looking at Agnes's hands. The courier appeared at 8:17. She came walking up the gravel path from a parked sedan below the hill, not hurried, not nervous, dressed like someone arriving for a bank appointment. She was in her early 40s, slim and tidy, with straight dark hair tucked behind her ears, light olive skin, and a moss-green coat buttoned to the throat. Her face was pleasant in a practiced way, the sort of face that had learned how to appear harmless in other people's doorways. She carried a leather folder under one arm. Later, we would learn the name on her identification was false, but in that moment she was simply the woman reaching for Agnes Rowe's trust. Agnes lifted her chin as the woman reached the bottom step. "Mrs. Rowe?" the courier asked. Agnes nodded. The courier smiled. Chapel porch. Even through the van's equipment, the words seemed to land too softly. They were not shouted. They were not threatening. That was what made them dangerous. Fear often entered quietly, wearing good manners. Agnes looked toward the window where Ruth stood out of sight. Then she looked down at the bag. "You are the receiver?" "I am here to secure the property record," the courier said. "You have done very well." I felt Rin stiffen. The courier stepped onto the first porch step and extended one hand. According to the plan, Agnes only had to pass over the bag. Instead, the woman tilted her head toward the path. "There is one more confirmation form in the car. Just a few steps, Mrs. Rowe. It will make sure your husband's file stays protected." Daniel's hand went up. "Stand by." Agnes shifted. One slipper moved toward the edge of the porch. My chest tightened. The rule had been crossed, but only by an inch, the kind of inch that could vanish in a report and change a life in the real world. The courier did not grab her. She did not need to. She used Thomas's name like a hand at Agnes's back. The morning suddenly narrowed to 3 sounds: the creak of the wooden step, Rin's thin whine against my coat, and a small metallic tick as something slipped inside the cloth bag. Agnes had opened her palm. A dull gold ring caught the sunlight for one bright second before she pushed it deeper among the weighted bars and whispered, "I am sorry, Thomas." I stopped being an observer. Before Daniel finished saying my name, I had opened the van door. Cold air hit my face. Wet grass soaked my shoes as I ran up the slope, one arm tight around Rin, the other raised toward Agnes like I could hold her in place from 30 yards away. "Mrs. Rowe, no!" I called. My voice broke across the yard. "Do not step off the porch." Agnes turned, startled. The courier's pleasant face disappeared as if a curtain had dropped. Her fingers closed around the bag strap. Agnes instinctively pulled back, and the cloth twisted between them. The bag slipped from Agnes's hands and struck the porch step with a heavy thud. The ring bounced free, rolled once along the wood, and came to rest near the toe of Thomas's old rocking chair. For half a heartbeat, everyone stared at it. Then Daniel moved. "Go," he said into the radio. Agents came from both sides of the house, fast but controlled. Ruth opened the front door and drew Agnes back with a firm arm around her shoulders. The courier turned toward the steps, but a local task force officer blocked the path below. She did not fight. She only lifted both hands slowly, her face pale now, her eyes calculating where kindness had failed her. Daniel reached the porch as I did. He gave me one hard look, not anger exactly, but the kind of look that said a lesson would arrive later and bring its own chair. "You broke position." "She was leaving the porch," I said, breathless. "And the ring." "I saw." His voice softened by half a shade. "Secure the victim first." Ruth had Agnes inside the doorway, but Agnes was not looking at Ruth or Daniel or the courier. She was looking at the ring on the step. I bent down and picked it up with gloved fingers. It was warm from the sun and worn thin at the edges. Such a small thing, I thought. Too small to carry 48 years of marriage. And yet it did. I placed it in Agnes's open hand. Her fingers closed around it, trembling. She pressed the ring to her chest, not dramatically, not for anyone watching, but like a person holding the last candle in a dark church. Tears filled her eyes and slipped down her cheeks in silence. "He found me by the porch light after all," she whispered. Rin, still tucked against me, stopped whining. The courier was seated on the lower step, while Daniel's team searched her folder and removed a small earpiece from beneath her hair. Mara's voice came through the radio from the van. "Daniel, you need to hear this." We gathered around the playback inside the house. Agnes sat on the sofa with Ruth beside her, the ring safely back on its chain. Daniel played the audio captured from the courier's earpiece. At first there was static, then a man's voice, low and impatient, spoke through the line. "If the ring is in the bag, move to the antique lot." No one moved. The sentence changed everything. The ring had not been an accident. It had not been a sentimental detail that Agnes alone had carried into danger. It was part of the test. If she surrendered the ring, then whoever waited at the next point would know she had been brought past ordinary fear and into obedience. Gold was only the first gate. The memory was the second. The courier's false calm did not last long after that. Her real name, she said, was Lena Voss. She was 39, from outside Grand Rapids, with debt, a suspended license, and a talent for sounding official. She claimed she did not know the real man behind the calls. She had only heard the code name, Ledger. The bag was supposed to go to the rear lot of Harbor Ledger Antiques. She was to confirm whether the personal piece was included before moving it onward. Daniel listened without showing surprise. "Who receives it at the lot?" Lena looked down at her hands. "I do not know. I never see the top person, but when Ledger cares about a piece, somebody comes to check." Agnes closed her eyes. I felt the shame in the room try to settle on her, and I would not let it. "Mrs. Rowe," I said softly, "they did not get your ring." She opened her eyes and looked at Rin first, then at me. "No," she said. Her voice was fragile but clear. "They did not?" Outside, the porch light still burned in the morning. The bag sat sealed on the table now, no longer a thing of fear, but a road we could follow. Daniel turned to Mara, then to me. "We have 48 hours, he said. "We use a duplicate ring. Same bag, same weight. We let Ledger believe the porch was completed." I looked at Agnes, then at the ring resting against her heart. The lesson Daniel had promised with his eyes was still coming. I had broken position, but the old woman had not stepped off the porch, and Thomas Rowe's ring had not left that house. For that morning, that was enough. By the 9th morning, the cloth bag no longer belonged to Agnes Rowe's fear. It belonged to the case. Mara had replaced the weighted bars, checked the tracker, and placed a duplicate ring inside the lining where Thomas's real ring had been. The copy was not perfect, but it did not need to be. It only needed to pass through the quick glance of a man who believed grief could be measured, marked, and moved along like inventory. Daniel would not let Lena Voss walk the bag into the antique lot. That would have been too clean, too suspicious, too easy for Bellamy to sense. Instead, Lena gave us the message pattern, the timing, the punctuation, even the little careless way the courier network shortened words when they thought no one important was reading. At 9:14 a.m., from Lena's phone, Mara sent the line. "Porch complete. Moving to antique lot." We waited behind the old feed store across from Harbor Ledger Antiques. The shop looked almost tender in the daylight. Its green sign with gold letters swung above the window, and inside the glass were polished clocks, lace table runners, brass lamps, and a little wooden cradle nobody had rocked for 50 years. That was Bellamy's gift. He knew how to arrange memory, so it looked safe. Daniel sat beside me in the surveillance car, one hand resting near the radio, his face unreadable beneath the brim of a dark cap. Rin slept in my lap for nearly 10 minutes, then woke with a soft grunt and pressed his nose against my wrist. He was still just a 2-month-old German Shepherd puppy, all oversized paws and solemn eyes. But after 10 days in Willow Harbor, I had stopped thinking of him as merely small. Some souls arrive young and already listening. Mara watched the tracker from the van. Ruth stayed with Agnes on the hill. Harold and Eleanor were under quiet welfare checks. We had learned not to leave people alone with fear after the phone stopped ringing. The bag was placed, as instructed, behind a rusted blue delivery bin at the rear lot of Harbor Ledger Antiques. No one touched it for 19 minutes. Then Graham Bellamy appeared. He came through the back door in the same brown wool sweater, as if dressing kindly had become part of his trade. He was broad-shouldered and composed, gray beard neat along his jaw, silver hair brushed back, eyes gentle enough to fool a room full of lonely people. He did not hurry. He looked once toward the alley, once toward the street, then crouched beside the delivery bin and opened the cloth bag with gloved hands. Daniel lifted the radio to his mouth but did not speak yet. We needed the confirmation. Bellamy moved the weighted bars aside. His fingers found the ring. For the first time, his face changed. It was not joy. It was satisfaction, colder and smaller. He held the duplicate ring up to the light as if inspecting the strength of Agnes's heart. Then he took out his phone and placed a call. "She surrendered the ring," he said. "She is ready for the second transfer." Daniel's voice cut through the radio. "Move." The lot filled with motion, clean and controlled. Agents came from the alley and the side street. Bellamy stood, not frightened at first, more offended than afraid, like a man interrupted during a private appointment. He looked at Daniel, then at me, and for one strange second his expression settled into disappointment, as if we had failed to understand the beauty of his system. "You have no idea how many of them wanted to talk," he said, as Daniel secured the phone. "They brought me those stories willingly." A church bell sounded from inside the shop, soft, solemn, and false. The same tone from Eleanor's call rolled through the back door and over the pavement. Bellamy turned his head toward it, and the gentle mask slipped from his face. In that pause, with the fake bell trembling in the air, every porch in Willow Harbor seemed to answer back. The search of Harbor Ledger antiques took the rest of the day. The evidence was not hidden in one dramatic chest. It lived in fragments, the way harm often does. A USB taped behind the music box cabinet, printed porch photographs tucked beneath drawer liners, appraisal cards marked with private notes, a folder of fake federal logos, pickup codes, call scripts, audio files of the antique bell, a spreadsheet of older residents with comments beside their names, lives alone, widow, son out of state, ring important, afraid of banks, answers after supper. Mara found transfers showing Bellamy had first sold customer research to an out-of-state contact when his shop began failing. Then the payments grew. So did the notes. At some point, he had stopped being a struggling shopkeeper and become a guide through other people's loneliness. Daniel handled the legal pieces. Mara handled the evidence. Ruth brought Agnes down only after Bellamy was gone, and only because Agnes asked to see the shop with her own eyes. She arrived wearing Thomas's real ring on its chain. She did not step inside. She stood on the sidewalk, looked through the window at the pretty clocks and polished lamps, and said, "He made the past look so safe." I had no answer worthy of her. On the 10th evening, the town gathered in the little white church near the square. Daniel spoke first, calm and plain, explaining that the investigation would continue beyond Willow Harbor and that the victims would not be left to manage the aftermath alone. Mara followed with practical advice about calls, codes, urgent threats, and why no real agency would demand gold from a porch. She kept it simple. People listened. Some held hands. Some looked at the floor. Shame has a way of searching for a chair, but that night we did not give it one. When it was my turn, I had prepared more words than I used. I looked at Eleanor, Harold, Marion Lark, and Agnes in the front pew. Marion was a thin woman in her late 70s with silver curls, a sharp chin, and a sewing basket clutched in her lap as if it had survived the storm with her. Harold had worn a tie, badly knotted, but brave. Agnes sat with the ring against her chest. "They did not fool you because you were weak," I said. "They chose you because you had something worth protecting." That was all. It was enough. Afterward, Harold slipped Rin a crumb of biscuit when he thought I was not looking. Rin accepted it with the solemn gratitude of a tiny king receiving tribute. For the first time in 10 days, I laughed. Daniel heard it and pretended not to, which was the closest he came to mercy after my run across Agnes's lawn. Later, we drove Agnes home. She walked to the porch slowly, touched the back of Thomas's rocking chair, and turned on the light. Then she placed a fresh cup of tea on the small table beside it. not for fear. Not because a caller had told her to stand near a memory, because love, when it is true, does not become foolish just because someone tried to use it. On the road out of Willow Harbor, Rin slept in my arms as the town passed by in soft yellow windows. One by one, porch lights glowed against the northern dusk. I was still young. I still had so much to learn. But that file taught me something I carried into every case after it. Justice is not only the moment a badge closes around a lie. Sometimes justice is an old woman opening her own door again, hearing the phone ring, and knowing she does not have to be afraid. At the end of this story, perhaps the lesson is simple. Evil often begins when good people are made to feel alone, but healing begins when someone chooses to notice. Agnes was not saved by gold, paperwork, or fear. She was saved because one young agent listened, one little dog sensed what others missed, and one quiet community remembered that no elder should have to face the dark by themselves. In our daily lives, we may not stand in the middle of an FBI case, but we all pass by porches, windows, and lonely hearts. Sometimes a phone call, a kind visit, a shared meal, or a simple question can protect someone more than we know. Check on the elderly neighbor. Listen to the widow who tells the same story twice. Be patient with the father who worries too much. And never laugh at someone who has been deceived, because fear can cloud even the wisest heart when it comes wearing the voice of authority. This story also reminds us that animals are not just pets beside us. Sometimes they are small messengers of grace. A dog may not understand bank accounts or courtrooms, but a loyal heart can feel sorrow before words are spoken. Treat animals with gentleness. Feed them, shelter them, protect them, and respect the love they give so freely. In a world that often grows cold, God may send comfort through the warm eyes of a faithful dog. Maybe that is the quiet miracle in this story. Not thunder from the sky, but a porch light still burning, a ring returned to the right hands, and a frightened soul learning to open the door again. God's mercy often arrives through ordinary people who choose to care at the right moment. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness still matters. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from, or share the name of an animal that once helped you through a hard season. And if you believe stories like this can bring hope, comfort, and a little more light into the world, please subscribe to the channel. May God bless you, protect your home, watch over your loved ones, and place kind hearts along your path when you need them most.